In January of 1943, New York City was wrapped in winter haze. Inside the Hotel New Yorker, a room sat unmoved curtains drawn against a pale sky, trunks stacked like sealed chapters. The man who owned them, Nikola Tesla, was gone. The public story ended as an obituary. Inventor, eccentric, a mind outpaced by the century he helped ignite. But the archive begins where death becomes paperwork. 2 days after Tesla's passing, federal representatives arrived not with cameras for commemoration, but with forms, seals, and inventory tags. A government witness later described an urgent interest in preserving what was inside. Trunks were opened, papers were gathered. The room's air, already dry with radiator heat, seemed to crackle with a different kind of static, the sound of a life reduced to files. Here is the anomaly, not a single missing photograph, but a missing certainty. Lists exist, releases exist, later declassifications exist, and yet the record still leaves space where the imagination can enter. A portion of what Tesla left behind became a moving target, disputed, delayed, recategorized as if the archive itself could not decide whether it was engineering history or something more volatile. On the desk in surviving images, the objects look ordinary paper edges, metal clasps, a lamp casting weak light. But beneath the ordinary sits a question Tesla never stopped asking. What if the air above us is not empty, but charged, harvestable, measurable, responsive? The camera, if we imagine it, lingers on the trunks. Dust floats through a thin beam of light, the reel stutters, and somewhere behind the bureaucratic silence, a tower returns to the frame, a spire, pointed into weather, waiting for a charge the textbooks call atmospheric electricity, and other interpreters call something older. History remembers progress, but forgets what it replaced. Act 1, the official story. How 19th century science and architecture openly pursued the sky's electricity. In the early 1860s at Kew Observatory in Richmond, near London, the weather was not only measured, it was recorded. Rain gauges, thermometers, barometers, these fit the era's faith in instruments. But one system was more elusive. It was not measuring temperature or pressure, it was measuring the electric state of the air. A conductor rose above the building, an elevated point meeting the sky, and below it a device transformed invisible charge into traceable data, Kelvin's water dropper potential equalizer, coupled to automatic recording. In official terms, it was not mysticism, it was metrology. The air held an electric potential gradient, changing with weather, pollution, and storms. The device allowed that gradient to be observed continuously, a line drawn by light onto sensitized paper. The artifact here is simple and almost ritualistic. Water falling, drop by drop, turning sky charge into readable motion. The sound motif begins as a faint ticking drip, joined by the soft hiss of damp air against metal fittings, and the mechanical whisper of a recording mechanism. A human trace survives in the phrasing of the era, engineers pushing for continuous measurement rather than occasional readings. The official record is consistent. This was a scientific instrument, installed and used for years, part of an emerging discipline of atmospheric electricity. And yet even here, an unease enters through time. Some summaries name 1861, others soften it to the early 1860s. That small blur 1 year sliding into another becomes a pattern we will keep seeing. Not a conspiracy, just an archive doing what archives do, letting edges fray. Present-day continuity is direct. Modern field mills and meteorological sensors still track the electric field. But the shape of the measurement, an elevated point, a grounded body, a flowing medium, already resembles a principle later readers would describe as architectural. Take the sky's charge, let it speak through structure. The chapter ends not with revelation, but with a photograph in the mind, a dome, a rod, London haze, and a line slowly writing itself in silence. What else was the 19th century measuring without naming? By the 15th of August, 1881, the summer air in Paris carried heat and coal smoke. Along the Champs, Élysée, at the Palais de l'Industrie, the city staged a demonstration that was both technical and theatrical, the International Exposition of Electricity. Officially, It was a showcase, lighting systems, telegraphy, dynamos, an inventory of modern power. The artifact anchor is the exhibition itself. Machines arranged like reliquaries. Lamps burning with a hard brilliance that seemed to erase shadows rather than soften them. The sound motif expands. Arc lamps buzz, belts whir, visitors' footsteps echo on industrial floors. In the Associated Congress, the era tried to discipline electricity into stable language volt, ohm, ampere units as a kind of containment. The official story is clean. An emerging field professionalizes itself. Electrical engineering is born in public, under glass and iron. But the camera, our imaginary restoration reel, pans upward. The roof structure resembles a vaulted nave. The building reads like a temple built for a new invisible force. Here the narrative can remain factual and still feel uncanny. The 19th century repeatedly used architectural grandeur to frame electrical power as destiny. A human witness line appears in the institutional tone of archival memory. The exhibition was remembered as a showcase for a new branch of engineering. Nothing suppressed, just celebrated. The time tension here is subtler. Later retellings sometimes compress the exposition into a vague, early 1880s moment, while the original dates are precise. Meanwhile, alternative interpreters sometimes relocate the entire aesthetic backward, claiming such halls must be remnants of an older world because they look too confident, too complete. The record does not require that leap, but it explains why the leap is tempting. Continuity to today is visible in every tech expo, every convention hall humming with displays. The motif returns, a mechanical hum beneath human voices, as if the building itself is resonating. As the chapter fades, dust drifts through electric light. If you can standardize the units, you can forget the wonder that came before them, what vanished when electricity became only a number. On the 31st of March, 1889, Gustave Eiffel led officials and press up a structure that still looked impossible. The Eiffel Tower, completed in time for Paris's Exposition Universelle. Iron underfoot, wind sliding through latticework, the city shrinking into geometry below. Officially, the tower was a technical feat and, crucially, a temporary one. It was tied to a concession, a monument built for an exposition, not necessarily for permanence. The artifact is its form, a gigantic iron spire, narrowing into the sky, crowned by equipment and platforms that would soon invite experiments no one advertised in the earliest brochures. The sound motif sharpens. The wind whistles. Metal joints click with thermal movement. Footsteps ring on stairs. The tower is a tuning fork for weather. Here the contradiction is documented in plain language. A structure treated administratively as temporary, yet engineered with a seriousness that feels permanent. This is not evidence of a lost empire. It is evidence of how modernity builds, with public spectacle on top and infrastructure potential underneath. A human witness line emerges from accounts of the day. Eiffel explained features during the ascent. The dedication took place even before all lifts were finished. The tower's story is not hidden, it is recorded. The timestamp unease arrives again in how people remember it. Some retellings flatten the tower's timeline into 1889 and then always, while other accounts emphasize its planned end around the concession's limit. Alternative readers push harder, suggesting the tower's antenna-like form implies a prior purpose. Official history does not need that claim to admit the obvious. The tower is perfectly shaped to meet the sky. Cut to present-day Paris, the same silhouette still stands, now explicitly wired for communication and broadcast. The film reel lingers on the summit, an elevated point against cloud. In the archive, it was labeled temporary. In iron, it was built to last. If history is written by survivors, who erase the rest? Act 2, the anomalies. When towers, domes, and spires begin behaving like instruments whether or not they were meant to. On the 5th of November, 1898, Paris was cold enough to sharpen sound. High on the Eiffel Tower, Eugène Ducretet installed a transmitter and reached across the city to the Panthéon, about 4 kilometers away. The artifact is both humble and revolutionary. Wireless telegraphy equipment, elevated not in a lab but on an iron spire exposed to wind. Officially, this was an experiment in a new medium. The record is specific, a public demonstration, observed by representatives of a scientific establishment. The sound motif changes again. Now it is the click-click of Morse, faint but decisive, like a heartbeat translated into code. The archival tension here is not whether it happened, but what it implied. A tower built for spectacle becomes within a decade an antenna platform. The official story frames this as pragmatic reuse. The visual contradiction is more poetic. A monument sold as temporary begins collecting invisible waves from the air, as if its true function arrives after its supposed purpose ends. Time stutters in the retellings. Some accounts emphasize November 1898. Others foreground 1899, when waves crossed the channel. In the archive, those are separate milestones. In memory, they blur into one mythic first transmission. That blur is how legends form without anyone forging a document. A human witness line is embedded in the event itself. A demonstration staged not in secrecy but under observation science performed as public ritual. Continuity to the present is immediate. Every skyscraper antenna, every rooftop mast, every city's invisible mesh of signals. And for those who read with an alternative lens, the pattern feels louder. Elevation plus metal plus air equals communication or perhaps energy. The camera cuts down to street level. The Pantheon's stone dome absorbs the coded message like a silent listener. Fog curls at rooflines. If towers can carry messages, what else can they carry? By May of 1893, Chicago opened the gates of the world's Columbian Exposition. Officially, it was a celebration of modern industry and national ambition. But visually, it arrived like an ancient ideal, reborn in plaster and paint, domes, colonnades, statuary, an entire white city, facing a basin of water that reflected electric light. The artifact anchor is documented, the electricity building, designed for exhibits devoted to power, and signal its very entrance marked by a statue of Benjamin Franklin, lightning rod pioneer turned civic icon. Inside, the exhibits demonstrated electrical systems. Outside, the fair itself became a luminous argument for alternating current and industrial scale. The sound motif is layered, the low thrum of generators, the murmur of crowds, the distant splash of fountains, dust in sunbeams by day. By night, light so bright it appears to flatten shadows into a single plane. The archival record is consistent. The buildings were largely temporary, many later removed. And yet the visual contradiction remains. Photographs make temporary architecture look eternal. Alternative interpretations often enter here, claiming the White City must have been older, rediscovered, because it appears too grand to be built and dismantled so quickly. The official documentation does not support that conclusion, but it explains the temptation. The camera can make plaster look like marble, and memory can make a fair look like a lost capital. The timestamp unease becomes a documented contrast between record and later myth. 1893 is fixed in the Expositions chronology, but alternative timelines float older dates like ghosts. The archive does not require them. A human witness line can be paraphrased from contemporary astonishment. Visitors described the night illumination as unprecedented and artificial dawn. The fair proved that electricity could become architecture's second skin. Cut to present-day Chicago. Few structures remain, but the city's skyline now carries antennas, spires, lightning protection, new materials repeating old geometry. If the buildings vanished, why does the shape of them keep returning? On Friday, the 25th of August, 1893, in a hall adjoining Chicago's Exposition grounds, Nikola Tesla delivered a lecture on mechanical and electrical oscillators. The artifact anchor is textual and real. A published lecture describing devices that create steady vibration, mechanical pulses, and high-frequency electrical effects, paired with apparatus in the room and an air compressor driven by an electric motor. Officially, this was engineering. But the language of oscillation, frequency, resonance, constant periods carries a second meaning when placed beside architecture, because spires, domes, and towers are also forms that interact with vibration, wind-borne hum, bell resonance, structural harmonics. The sound motif tightens to a single thread, vibration, felt more than heard. The camera lingers on metal components. On the way, light catches copper windings. Dust drifts. The voiceover becomes quieter, more technical. The archival tension is not a missing page, it is an interpretive gap. Tesla's lecture belongs to an official scientific record, yet later culture turns it into prophecy, wireless power, atmospheric charge, energy from air. The archive shows what he demonstrated and described. The myth expands what he might have meant. The timestamp unease appears in how the lecture circulates. Reprints and summaries sometimes detach it from its specific evening and context, turning 1893 into a floating emblem rather than a date pinned to a room. The difference matters. In an actual archive, a day is a boundary line. A human witness line survives in the formal introductions and the descriptions of apparatus used. The event is recorded as a lecture, not a legend. Continuity to the present is everywhere. Wireless communication depends on oscillators. Power grids depend on frequency control. The same hidden heartbeat runs modern systems. It was meant to be progress, but progress often comes at a cost. If oscillation is the language of modern power, who first taught architecture to speak it? In 1899, outside Colorado Springs, Tesla built a laboratory that looked like a barn from a distance until you noticed the roof could roll back, and a tower rose beside it. Above that tower, a metal mast reached higher still, topped with a copper ball. Official accounts preserved the geometry because the geometry mattered. Elevation, insulation, exposure to thin, high-altitude air and frequent storms. The artifact anchor is visual. Photographs and descriptions of an experimental station designed for high voltage, high-frequency work, aiming impulses into the ground and testing the behavior of air and earth as conductors. The sound motif becomes violent but measured. Thunder beyond the walls, sharp snapping discharges. Then, in the calm between experiments, the steady hum of equipment cooling down. Here the archival contradiction is beautifully mundane and therefore believable. Different reputable descriptions emphasize different numbers. One account describes a mast around 142 feet. Another describes a pole around 150 feet through the lab's center. Both can be true depending on what is being measured, mast, pole, or total assembly, but the mismatch is enough to remind us, even when the record exists, it is not always singular. A human trace emerges through technicians assembling coils, through Tesla's own recorded focus on atmospheric purity and lightning. No invented diaries are needed. The documented setting is vivid enough. The timestamp unease comes in the station's afterlife. The work occurred in 1899. Later retellings sometimes smear it into a broader turn-of-the-century haze. And alternative interpreters sometimes relocate the technology backward, claiming Tesla was rediscovering an older system rather than building a new one. The archive supports Tesla's authorship. The alternative reading remains a reading, not a record. Cut to present day. Tall masts still carry copper and steel into storms, broadcast towers, lightning systems, atmospheric sensors. The form persists because the physics persists. The chapter ends on a visual cue, a copper sphere against a blackening sky, momentarily catching the last light before a storm. If the air can be charged enough to light the night, why do we pretend the sky is empty? In 1900, Paris staged another world exposition, and at the end of the Champ de Mars rose a spectacle that was also infrastructure, the Palais de l'Électricité paired with the Château d'Eau. Officially, it was the Expositions showpiece electric applications displayed inside, and electricity distributed outward to feed other pavilions. The artifact anchor is photographic and catalogued, the facade blazing with lamps, the water castle's domes and fountains performing light as if it were liquid. The sound motif blends roaring water, generator thrum, and the distant crowd hush that sometimes follows overwhelming brightness, the way people go quiet when technology becomes scenery. Here the archival tension is not whether it existed, but how it functioned in plain sight. A building was both a facade and a power station. This is documented and mundane, yet it echoes the very claim that later alternative readers make, that ornate civic architecture, concealed functional energy systems. The timestamp unease appears in the way images travel. A photograph taken in 1900 can be reproduced on postcards, recopied in books, and later detached from its original caption. The record is stable in museum cataloguing, but popular memory blurs it. A human trace appears through institutional description. It was the clow, the nail, the highlight of the exposition. Not hidden, admired. Now the interpretive bridge can be stated carefully. Some interpreters see in the Palace of Electricity a blueprint for alternative design, ornament masking circuitry, domes and finials acting as collectors, water functioning as a conductive or cooling medium. The archive supports only the first layer, that electricity and architecture were fused for display and distribution. The rest is interpretation. Present-day continuity is obvious in stadiums and skylines lit like permanent expositions, public space powered into spectacle. The real fades on water, sprayed into light, turning into mist. When a power plant is dressed like a palace, how do we learn to recognize function again? If history is written by survivors, who erased the rest? Act 3, the forgotten technology. Not a secret machine, an overlooked principle. Elevated form, plus grounding, plus flow, can make the sky measurable, usable. In September of 1901, on Long Island near Shoreham, construction began on a facility that Tesla believed could scale his ideas into a world system. Warden Cliff. Officially, it was an experimental wireless transmission station funded through an agreement with J.P. Morgan, built with a laboratory building and a tall wooden tower topped by a dome-like cap. The artifact anchor here is architectural, the foundation, the lab building, and the idea of a tower as a machine. The sound motif is coastal, wind off the sound, the faint clatter of tools, the distant train rhythm that linked the site to the city that financed it. The archival tension is brutally documented, funding limits, design changes, and the eventual abandonment. There is no need to invent censors. The silence can be explained by economics, competition, and the fragility of grand projects. The timestamp unease arrives in the numbers. The tower is often described as built in 1901 through 1902, while broader summaries list it as simply built in 1901. Heights differ by a foot here and there in retellings. Small discrepancies like the Colorado mast are where the archive shows its human seams. A human trace appears in the investor relationship. Official accounts preserve that money came with conditions, and conditions can become constraints that decide what exists at all. This is where the alternative hypothesis is most emotionally tempting. Some readers look at a half-finished tower meant to interact with earth and sky and say, "This is not invention. This is recovery." The archive does not confirm that, but it confirms something adjacent. Tesla was consciously designing a system that treated the planet and atmosphere as an electrical environment. Present-day continuity, the site's later recognition as historic, and the broader reality that towers for communication now blanket the world, the very infrastructure Warden Cliff aimed to anticipate. The chapter ends with a ruin image, a tower that did not become a network, becoming instead an absence you can photograph. If a future is abandoned, does it leave traces that look like ancient history? In 1903, Paris rewrote the meaning of the Eiffel Tower. With the concession clock ticking toward an expected end, Gustave Eiffel supported wireless experiments by Gustave Ferrier, including installation of antenna arrangements and a working setup near the tower's base. Officially, this was practical. Wireless communication offered military and civic value. The tower gained a reason to remain. The artifact anchor is almost cinematic, an antenna at the summit, a cable run, and a small working space near one of the pillars where specialists operated equipment. The sound motif shifts from Morse clicks to a more continuous texture, the buzzer-like tone of early transmitters, the low electric rasp of apparatus being tuned. The archival tension is openly stated in the record. The tower's survival is linked to scientific and communications use. Not a hidden rescue documented, celebrated, retold by the tower's own institutional history. Timestamp unease persists. Ranges and milestones accumulate several hundred kilometers, then claims of thousands by later years, often simplified in popular summaries. The archive can hold nuance. The public loves a single dramatic number. A human trace survives through the decision itself. Eiffel's willingness to fund and support experiments. It is the quiet signature of patronage, an administrative choice that changes what the future inherits. Now the interpretive bridge can be made without breaking non-fiction. Alternative readings treat this as confirmation that towers were always meant to be antennas, and that earlier spires in other cities were the same kind of machine, simply unlabeled. The archive proves only that once wireless existed, elevated metal structures became invaluable. Present-day continuity is everywhere. The tower's silhouette is now inseparable from transmission. The spire is both monument and instrument. The chapter ends with night wind around ironwork, the tower broadcasting into darkness. If a tower can justify itself by carrying signals, what did older spires justify by carrying storms? Long before wireless made towers famous, atmospheric electricity had already begun forming a global observational network. At Q, systems recorded electric conditions for decades. Earlier efforts logged data at regular intervals in the mid-19th century. Instruments and methods spread supplied to sites beyond Britain, reaching as far as India and even the Arctic, in an attempt to understand whether the sky's electricity behaved locally or globally. The artifact anchor is not one tower but a repeating form, a copper rod protruding through a dome, an elevated collector paired with instruments below. The sound motif becomes quiet again, paper feeding through a recorder, the subtle scratch of a pen or photographic trace, the distant rumble of thunder that arrives later like a delayed answer. The archival tension here is not suppression, it is the slow fading of a field's public visibility. Atmospheric electricity was once a headline phenomenon, lightning conductors, public debates, dramatic storms. Then it became specialized, tucked into meteorological reports. The work continued, but the wonder drained out of the public narrative. The timestamp unease appears in a rare, documented discrepancy. Different summaries mark the end of long observational series slightly differently. 1980 in one description, 1981 in another, an echo of the small mismatches we have tracked since the 1860s. It is not proof of erasure. It is proof that even continuous measurement does not guarantee continuous memory. A human trace here is institutional rather than personal. Reports, series, routine. The people become silhouettes behind instruments, known only by the persistence of their recording. Now the alternative framework can be spoken with care, if elevated conductors and domes were used as collectors for measurement. Some readers ask whether civic spires and domes did something similar, less as explicit instruments, more as passive interfaces with the sky. The archive cannot confirm that intention, but it confirms that the physics charge concentrating at points, fields interacting with metal was well understood and actively used. Present-day continuity. Modern cities bristle with lightning protection, antennas, and sensors. The skyline is still a map of how humans negotiate the atmosphere. In the archive, it was labeled measurement. In the skyline, it became design. If history is written by survivors, who erased the rest? Act 4, the silence. How the record narrows. Towers demolished, fairgrounds cleared, papers seized, and alternative histories become a disputed lens rather than a documented empire. On the 9th of January, 1943, Tesla died in New York. What followed is documented not as romance but as procedure, federal involvement, investigation, and the seizure of possessions by the Office of Alien Property. The artifact anchor is bureaucratic but potent. Inventories, stored trunks, technical papers examined after his death. The sound motif becomes modern and eerie, radio-like static, the soft slap of file folders, the dull click of locks. Dust motes float in lamplight. The room's silence feels engineered. A human witness line enters through recorded official concern, phrasing that suggests urgency about what Tesla's papers might contain. Years later, declassifications and releases answered some questions but also fueled others. The archive exists, but it does not fully close the story, and that gap becomes oxygen for interpretation. The timestamp unease is now public. Documents were released in stages, long after the events they describe, and different summaries emphasize different release moments. The result is a timeline that feels discontinuous. 1943 sealed, then decades of silence, then partial illumination. It is important under non-fiction rules to hold the boundary. Documented seizure and later releases do not automatically prove suppression of a working free energy system. They prove something more mundane and still unsettling, that technological legacies can be handled as security concerns, and that an inventor's work can become state property without the public's consent. For the alternative-leaning viewer, the emotional logic is inevitable. If papers can vanish into custody, then perhaps architectural knowledge can vanish the same way through demolition, rebranding, and forgetting rather than flames. Present-day continuity, the way modern states classify, declassify, and curate technological history. Knowledge can be erased simply by being filed. The chapter ends on an image, a trunk lid closing, the sound of a latch, and a thin electrical hum fading under narration. If the archive itself can become a gatekeeper, what did it choose not to let us see? By June of 2025, in the United States, archivists and historians were still explaining something that older maps show plainly. Tartary or Tartaria was a Western European label applied to vast regions of Asia, an umbrella name used when geography was poorly understood, and naming carried myth as much as fact. The artifact anchor is the map itself, printed ink, declaring a world the printer never visited. The official record is consistent. Tartary and Tartaria is a historical toponym, not proof of a single hidden global empire, and yet the word persists because it behaves like a magnet for pattern hunters. If a label can cover half a continent, what else did it cover? Cultures, technologies, architectures that were never described in their own terms. This is where we can honor the alternative framework without breaking evidence, as a serious, interpretive lens, not Tartaria as confirmed, but Tartaria as a way some modern observers name a pattern. The pattern they point to is visual and global: domes with finials, spires crowned with metal, towers that resemble antennas, civic buildings that look like power temples. The archive explains many of these through known architectural movements and engineering needs: lightning protection, communication, ornament, status. But it does not erase the deeper fact. The same forms repeat because the same physics repeats. The recurring motif returns one last time: resonance, bells in towers, wind singing in iron, static crawling across points during storms, the sound of the sky interacting with what we build. Timestamp unease reaches its final form as a split between record and interpretation. Documented 18th and 19th century map labels on one side, claims of a much older, suppressed civilization on the other. The narrative refuses to collapse that gap with invention. It leaves it suspended because suspense is what archives create when they preserve objects but not meanings. Cut to the present cityscape: antennas disguised as spires, lightning rods atop glass, domes still crowned with metal points. The skyline looks modern until you realize it is still negotiating the same charged air. The reel ends mid-frame, a spire against cloud, a faint hum, a flicker, then silence. If the sky is still charged above us, what part of the old design are we still repeating without remembering why?